The jeepney's brakes squealed before it stopped, the rattle of metal harmonizing with the hum of Manila's morning bustle. Inside, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, the scent of diesel and street food lingered in the humid air. Among the passengers was Minho, a 22-year-old student from South Korea, clutching his backpack as though it were an anchor in this world of unfamiliar sounds and colors. His eyes absorbed the disorienting scene through the window, hawkers shouting prices in Tagalog, tricycles darting between cars, students in crisp uniforms laughing and jostling each other. Everything felt chaotic and bewildering because it was. The driver hollered something that might have been directions or warning, but the words were unintelligible to Minho. When the jeepney slowed near a wrought iron gate flanked by stone pillars, he recognized only the shape of the sign, University of Sto. Tomas. Something in him clicked. Surrounded by a crowd that moved like a river, he stepped down onto the blistering pavement with a nervous breath and made his way toward the university's open gates. The campus sprawled out before him, a mix of colonial architecture and new concrete buildings shaded by sprawling acacia trees. And with each step he wondered if he had truly prepared for what lay ahead. Across the entrance, Minho felt both overshadowed and invisible. Students swirled around him in clusters, calling greetings, exchanging jokes, navigating the campus with an ease that suggested this place was utterly familiar to them. Minho carried his crumpled class schedule in his hand like a lifeline, every number representing another unknown. He scanned building signs, matching them to the inscrutable code that would determine where he was supposed to be. A group of students speaking rapid Tagalog brushed past, laughing without noticing him, their voices threading into the campus noise. A faint sense of alienation washed over him, but he kept moving, determined to find room B205. The signage led him to an old stairwell where other students lounged comfortably on the steps, eating pandesal and sipping juices from plastic bags. Conversation buzzed around him like static. Finally, he found the classroom door and stepped inside. The room was already half full of students sitting in loose social clusters, unpacking snacks, showing each other memes, and sharing drinks. In the back corner, untouched by the chatter, Minho chose a seat by the window where the sunlight spilled across the desks. Everything felt distant, filtered, muffled by his nerves as he arranged his notebook, pens, and water with careful precision, like the ritual could somehow tame the unease inside him. As more students filed in, laughter and chatter built into a crest of sound that washed through the room, only to recede when the professor stood at the front. She was a woman of quiet authority, glasses perched low on her nose, her voice warm as she greeted the class in English, a lingua franca in this multilingual setting. The students responded in unison, the phrase echoing off the walls like a practiced performance. Minho said nothing. For 2 hours, he listened and wrote, his handwriting neat and exact, trying to follow every concept even when he struggled to parse the rapid shifts between English terms and Tagalog expressions peppered throughout the lecture. Around him, classmates whispered and passed notes, screens lit with messaging apps, a phone buzzed stealthily under a desk. His own notebook accumulated a single word in the margin that captured his internal state. Alone. When the professor announced a break, the room erupted once more, students rising, stretching, and forming small social clusters. Minho remained seated, an island in a sea of motion, and pulled out his phone to check messages. A single question from his aunt in Korea asked how his first day had gone. He didn't respond. Instead, he locked the screen and looked out the window at a campus that suddenly felt loathed and beloved in equal measure. Just beyond the classroom, the cafeteria buzzed with an energy that could have belonged to any school in the world. Laughter, shouting, food traded between friends, memories made in real time. Minho followed the tide of students, keeping his distance but unable to stop himself from being carried along toward the chaos. The scents hit him immediately: fried rice, grilled meat seasoned with soy and vinegar, the warm sweetness of bread. Inside, long wooden tables sagged under trays heaped with shared meals. Hands reached across dishes like habitual ritual. Minho froze at the entrance, overwhelmed by the noise and the sheer volume of bodies intertwining around him. Rather than approach the food stalls, he found a corner near a dingy bulletin board, sat alone, and pulled out a familiar comfort: a packet of Korean instant ramen he had carried all this way. He boiled water in his thermos, set a timer, and waited while scrolling through photos of his friends in Seoul, carefree, close, laughing at a cafe under city lights. He took his first bite, and the taste, instead of soothing, dredged up the distance between him and everything that once felt like home. It was horrible and necessary, a reminder of the ache of being far away and yet still deeply tethered to a life left behind. Across the cafeteria, a group of students caught his eye. 3 guys and 2 girls, lively and loud, faces animated as they passed a phone around. Then something changed. The tall young man with glasses that Minho had noticed earlier turned suddenly and pointed in his direction. The others followed his gaze, huddling close like a small current forming around a stone. Unease crept through Minho's ribs, that feeling he'd known before, of being noticed without invitation, of being the subject of whispers in a room full of strangers. He lowered his eyes, wishing he could melt into the floor. The group rose and began moving toward him. Panic lit his chest, but when they reached his table, their intent was not mockery. Instead, the tall student stood in front of him holding a tray overflowing with Filipino dishes, adobo, long beans, rice, and, incongruously, a bowl of kimchi. Beside him, another student unfurled a handmade banner reading, "Welcome home, Kuya Minho." Phones were raised, videos playing back, dozens of smiling faces holding signs and waving. The girl with the guitar began playing a familiar Korean lullaby, imperfect in pitch but heartfelt in effort. Minho watched, stunned, as the 5 students presented homemade food, music, and a banner, not as a welcome to a foreigner, but as an embrace of someone they intended to call family. Minho's hands trembled as the weight of what was happening finally reached him. The banner, the food, the unfamiliar faces smiling with intention rather than curiosity. None of it fit the story he had been telling himself since arriving. One of the students gently placed an envelope on the table, not demanding attention, simply offering it. Inside were handwritten pages explaining why this moment existed at all. The words spoke of another student years earlier, a Filipino scholar struggling alone in South Korea, welcomed unexpectedly by strangers who chose kindness without obligation. That generosity had not faded with distance or time. It had traveled back across borders, quietly waiting for a chance to return. Minho learned that part of his scholarship had been built by these same students and alumni, people who had pooled savings and effort not because they knew him, but because they recognized the weight of arriving alone. As he read about his mother, her hopes, her sacrifices, grief broke through his composure. Tears fell onto the paper, blurring ink and memory. The students did not interrupt or console him with words. They stayed. In that silence, Minho understood something essential. This was not pity. It was continuity. The cafeteria slowly noticed. Conversations softened, then stopped altogether as nearby students sensed something unfolding that deserved attention. A quiet respect spread outward, replacing noise with stillness. Minho finally looked up, eyes red, chest tight, struggling to steady his voice. He managed only a whispered thank you before bowing deeply, a gesture reserved in his culture for gratitude beyond repayment. When he rose, the tall student extended his hand, not ceremonially, but casually, as equals. Their handshake grounded him. Applause began somewhere behind him, hesitant at first, then stronger, until the entire cafeteria echoed with clapping and cheers. The sound washed over Minho like a wave, overwhelming and affirming all at once. The group pulled chairs around his table, insisting he eat, teasing him gently that family never lets anyone dine alone. Laughter replaced tension. He tasted Filipino food for the first time, unfamiliar flavors mingling with homemade kimchi that carried echoes of his past. In that shared meal, distance collapsed. Nationality faded. What remained was something simpler and rarer, belonging that did not require explanation. By the time the noise returned to normal, Minho was no longer seated at the edge of the room. He was firmly at the center of something new. The days that followed rewrote Minho's routine without ceremony. In classrooms, he no longer sat alone in the back corner. Notes were shared with whispered translations, jokes passed mid-lecture, and corrections offered patiently when Tagalog phrases tangled on his tongue. In return, he taught his friends Korean slang and helped them practice writing Hangul in the margins of notebooks. Lunch became a shared ritual rather than an obstacle, trays pushed together, arguments erupting playfully over the last piece of food. Late nights in the library blurred into laughter-filled study sessions, repeatedly interrupted by librarians enforcing silence. On weekends, Miho joined basketball games he barely understood, missing shots spectacularly and laughing harder than anyone else. At a campus cultural festival, he wore a barong Tagalog, posing for photos beneath the same banner that had welcomed him on his first day. The image of himself shifted quietly. He was no longer a foreign student surviving an experience. He was part of a living exchange, one that thrived on shared effort rather than shared language. Loneliness did not vanish entirely, but it lost its authority. It became a passing emotion instead of a defining condition. One evening, as the campus settled into a rare quiet, Miho sat alone on a wooden bench beneath fading sunlight. He opened a video call, connecting not to a face, but to a cemetery in South Korea. His aunt stood there holding the phone, angling it toward his mother's grave, freshly adorned with white flowers. Miho spoke softly in Korean, telling her what he had nearly done on that first day, how close he had come to giving up. His voice steadied as he explained that she had been right, that he had found people who cared, people who chose him before he believed he deserved it. As he spoke, familiar footsteps approached. His friends noticed the call and hesitated, unsure whether to intrude. Miho waved them closer. They sat quietly beside him, listening without understanding the words but grasping their meaning. When the call ended, no one rushed to fill the silence. A gentle melody drifted from the guitar, and someone passed him a bottle of soda with a nudge and a smile. In that moment, grief did not isolate him. It connected him, across cultures, across loss, across time. From that night forward, Miho stopped thinking of his journey as something temporary he needed to endure. The university no longer felt like a maze to survive, but a place where his presence mattered. The photograph of his mother remained on his desk, but beside it now sat another image, 6 friends standing close, laughing without restraint. The contrast did not replace one memory with another. It connected them. Miho understood that what had happened to him was not spontaneous kindness, but intentional continuity, an unspoken agreement passed between strangers who once needed the same grace. The Filipino students who welcomed him had not erased his grief or rewritten his past. They had expanded his present. In doing so, they demonstrated something rarely taught in classrooms, that generosity, when practiced deliberately, travels farther than ambition. Miho arrived believing he was alone in a foreign country. What he discovered instead was a living tradition of care that crossed borders without hesitation. His first day had begun with uncertainty and silence. It ended with a truth he would carry far beyond the campus gates, that home is not always where you come from, but where someone chooses to make room for you. As the semester unfolded, Miho found himself woven deeper into the fabric of campus life. What once felt alien, noisy hallways, chaotic food stalls, unfamiliar gestures, became part of his daily rhythm. The group of students who had welcomed him evolved from friendly strangers into constants. Together, they navigated academic hurdles, laughed over cultural missteps, and marked their calendars with each other's traditions. On one Friday afternoon, Miho hosted a Korean food night in the dorm lounge, serving tteokbokki and bulgogi to eager friends who lined up with mismatched plates. In turn, they invited him to family homes during breaks, where he tasted home-cooked sinigang and learned the etiquette of saying "pa" and "opio" to elders. Tagalog phrases slipped more naturally into his speech, sometimes unconsciously. But the change wasn't just linguistic. Miho's posture changed, less guarded, more at ease. He raised his hand in class, asked questions, joined debates. Professors noticed. Classmates began to greet him in hallways. Even the cafeteria staff learned his name. It wasn't that he stopped being Korean. It was that his Korean identity no longer needed protection. It was welcomed, celebrated, and folded into the mosaic of the university's diverse student body. Cultural differences, once intimidating, became opportunities for shared laughter and learning. Miho's friends poked fun at his obsession with exact punctuality, while he teased them for their Filipino time flexibility. When he tried Halo Halo for the first time, he was horrified at the idea of beans in dessert, until the sweet milk and crushed ice won him over. Similarly, they watched Korean dramas together, mimicking dramatic dialogue and guessing plot twists. One of the girls even learned how to sing a Korean pop ballad, surprising him during karaoke night with near-perfect pronunciation. These shared moments chipped away at assumptions on both sides. The more they learned about each other's countries, the more they discovered similarities underneath the differences. Both cultures prized respect for elders, family bonds, community support. When news came of a typhoon threatening a province where one friend's family lived, Minho was the first to organize a small donation drive among international students. What had begun as survival in a foreign land was becoming something far more powerful, a mutual shaping. Minho was learning to belong, not by erasing who he was, but by expanding it to include the world around him. But it wasn't only inside campus walls where change occurred. Outside, in the bustling streets of Manila, Minho started to walk with confidence. Jeepney rides no longer disoriented him. He learned to listen for stops, to carry loose coins, to signal with a tap of the roof when he needed to get off. He began picking up street phrases and bargaining with sidewalk vendors with a grin. Local shopkeepers recognized him, often slipping him an extra banana cue or a discount on school supplies. He even found a favorite carinderia just 2 blocks from his dorm, where the owner always saved him a bowl of sinigang. At first, he visited out of necessity. Eventually, he came for the conversation. The city no longer loomed as something to be feared. It became familiar, layered with stories and faces that greeted him warmly. Every interaction, every kuya, every small act of welcome, deepened his understanding of what it meant to be part of a community. Even the relentless heat and chaotic traffic faded into background noise, replaced by rhythms he had grown to appreciate. The foreign had become familiar, not because it changed, but because he had. Throughout these experiences, Minho never stopped thinking about the letter that had changed everything. He kept it folded in his wallet, creased from rereading, the ink slightly smudged at the corners. Carlos, the Filipino student who had once been alone in soul, remained a name without a face, but his gesture had become a compass. Minho began writing his own letters, not always to send, but to remember. One addressed to a future Korean student who might feel lost in the same cafeteria. Another to his younger self, scared and homesick on the jeepney that first day. He also joined the university's international student outreach group, helping newcomers navigate enrollment and housing, showing them where to eat and how to ask directions in Tagalog. Every act, no matter how small, echoed that first tray of food and handmade banner. Kindness, he learned, did not need translation. It required intention. In giving back, he found healing, not from loss, but through it. His mother's memory stayed close, not as pain, but as inspiration. Her dream had not just been for him to study abroad, but to live fully. He was doing both now. By the end of the semester, Minho stood not as a visitor or outsider, but as someone who had shaped and been shaped by his new environment. His story was not unique in its beginning. Many arrive in foreign countries with uncertainty, clinging to memory and hoping for welcome. But what made his journey remarkable was how that welcome found him, surrounded him, and gave him space to transform. The university had become more than a school. It was a proving ground for a simple truth: that connection across cultures is possible when met with effort, openness, and compassion. Minho's life in the Philippines was not a detour. It had become a chapter of its own, written in shared meals, late-night study sessions, and songs sung in imperfect Korean. As he looked ahead to future semesters, to possibly mentoring others, or even studying further, he understood something deeper. He wasn't just a Korean student studying in the Philippines. He was part of a global circle of shared empathy, built on the idea that one act of kindness can ripple outward, touching lives in ways no classroom ever could. And in that realization, he was finally, undeniably, home.